There is a photograph that almost nobody talks about. It was taken in a corridor outside a closed-door meeting in Beijing, and the man in it looks like someone who has just been told the weather has changed and his umbrella is in the car. Consider what was happening in the world at that precise moment. The United States and Iran were closer to open conflict than at any point in a generation. American oil prices were spiking in ways that hadn't been modeled in peacetime projections. Across 3 American cities, protests that had begun on one grievance were absorbing others' energy costs, economic anxiety, the specific exhaustion of a country that had been running hot for years. And Donald Trump, a man who built his political identity on the art of the deal, on leverage, on projecting strength, was sitting across a table from Chinese counterparts who had been watching all of that calmly and with a great deal of patience. Here's what we know. When Trump arrived in Beijing for what the White House billed as a comprehensive trade and security dialogue, he was not negotiating from surplus. He was negotiating from need. That is the thread. That is the thing that doesn't quite add up. When you read the official statements, the readouts, the congratulatory communiques, the optics said partnership. The math said something else entirely. Go back 18 months before that visit. The architecture of American pressure on Iran had been rebuilt almost entirely by the Trump administration. Sanctions reapplied, nuclear deal exited, maximum pressure, that was the phrase, and they meant it. It worked in the sense that it produced a crisis. The question nobody asked loudly enough was, a crisis for whom? Iran's economy contracted, yes. But Iranian oil didn't vanish from the global market. It rerouted. And the primary beneficiary of that rerouting the country that quietly absorbed the discounted Iranian barrels that American pressure was supposed to deny the world was China. Notice what that means structurally. Every escalation Trump made against Iran had a secondary effect. It made China cheaper to run. China's energy import bill dropped as Iranian crude flowed in at prices no Gulf state would match. Meanwhile, American consumers were watching gasoline prices climb in ways that their paychecks couldn't absorb. The irony is not subtle once you see it. The administrat. ION's Iran strategy was, in effect, a subsidy to the Chinese economy paid for at American pumps. That is the context that preceded the Beijing meetings. But there is more to it, and this is where the paper trail gets more specific. In the weeks before the visit, 3 separate indicators were moving in directions that should have given Trump's economic team cause for concern. First, American shale production, the domestic safety valve that the administration always pointed to when energy prices rose, was bumping against infrastructure constraints. Pipelines were full, export terminals were backlogged. The domestic production story, which was true in its broad outlines, was running into the granular reality of a system not built for the pace of its own growth. Second, Chinese state media, which is not subtle when it wants to send a signal, had run a series of pieces in the month prior noting with some pleasure that American economic conditions were complex. That is diplomatic language in the Chinese context. It means we see you and we see your pressure points. Third, and this is the detail I keep coming back to, Treasury yield data from that period shows foreign holdings. American debt shifting in ways that are easy to miss in any single report, but become a pattern when you look at them over 6 consecutive quarters. China was not dumping treasuries. It was not doing anything dramatic. It was methodically and without announcement reducing its exposure. The revelation is not a single document. It rarely is. It is the accumulation of small facts pointing in the same direction. Trump walked into Beijing carrying a hand that was complicated in ways his public posture didn't acknowledge. The Iran escalation had not isolated Tehran. It had given Beijing a quieter advantage. The energy price spike that was feeding domestic unrest in American cities was simultaneously cushioning China's import costs. And the leverage Trump believed he carried the threat of tariffs. The economic pressure campaign was operating in a context where the other side had studied every card on the table and decided rationally that waiting was their best strategy. Here's what the Chinese side understood, that the American public wasn't being told in precise terms. The domestic political cost of the Iran escalation was not zero. Energy prices that rise fast enough become a point. Political event. Protests that begin as single issue often don't stay that way. They are joined by the person who just paid $40 more to fill their tank, by the small business owner whose freight costs have moved in the wrong direction 3 quarters in a row. Chinese analysts, and there are very good ones, had run those numbers. They knew that Trump needed a win from Beijing more than Beijing needed a win from Trump. Leverage is not what you say it is. It is what the other side calculates it to be. And here's the part that should concern all of us, not as a matter of partisan accounting, but as a matter of structural reality. The conditions that put Trump in a difficult position in Beijing are not unique to him. Any American administration that pursues maximum pressure in one theater without accounting for how that pressure creates opportunity in another is operating with an incomplete map. The Iran sanctions were designed to isolate a regional power. They partially succeeded at that, but they did not operate in a vacuum. They operated in a world with China in it. And China is very good at finding the vacuum. The geopolitical logic here outlasts any single administration. And when American foreign policy creates pressure somewhere, energy markets adjust. Rerouting is not a failure of the sanctioning regime. It is the regime working exactly as energy markets work, which is to say, around obstacles, the gap between what pressure campaigns promise and what commodity markets deliver is a gap that sophisticated counterparts have learned to inhabit. Beijing learned it earlier than most. 2 questions remain open, and they are worth sitting with. The first, were the specific terms of whatever understandings emerged from those Beijing meetings ever fully disclosed to Congress? There were briefings. There were classified annexes. But whether the energy pricing dynamics, specifically the way Iranian crude routing was shaping the bilateral balance, was ever laid out plainly for the relevant oversight committees remains, to put it gently, unclear. The second question is this. In the months that followed, Chinese energy import figures moved in a direction that suggested some accommodation had been reached not on paper, not in any treaty language, but in the quiet arithmetic of how much pressure the American side chose to apply, and where correlation is not causation, but it is a question. The thing about leverage is that it only works if the other side believes you're willing to use it and can afford to. In Beijing, in that room at that specific moment in history with the Middle East unsettled, with energy prices climbing, with American streets carrying the weight of that economic pressure, the arithmetic was not in Trump's favor. He went in needing something. The other side knew exactly what it was. That is not a talking point. That is just what happened.